Welcome to the Acts 2 Adult Education class on environmental justice. I am your fellow church member and classmate, Tony Arnold, and I teach at the University of Louisville. And research, write, and engage in community service in the field or area of environmental justice. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So this is a recording in advance in order to minimize technology problems. But we are going to have a live discussion at the end of the recorded presentation. This is part of the 2023 Earth Summer series, and we're focusing on the fact that in Micah 6:8 we're exhorted to do justice. And what does it mean to do environmental justice? What does that look like for the people of faith? Environmental justice is at the intersection of three different parts of living our faith in the world. One part of it is social justice for the poor and marginalized. Another is our call to be anti-racist and to engage in anti-racism activities and efforts. And the third is to care for and exercise stewardship for the earth or for God's creation. And at the intersection of these three different calls is the issue of environmental justice, the issue of environmental conditions experienced by people of color and by poor and marginalized peoples. So let's begin with a prayer to God. Dear God, we praise and thank you for our earthly home that supports our living and our being and our communities. We also raise up and think about and lift up marginalized people who live in unhealthy and unjust environments, who do not have the environmental conditions that all of us necessarily do. We confess, though, that we are part of that problem. We are part of society, part of humanity that hurts marginalized peoples, your people, as well as your creation, with environmental injustices. And we ignore these environmental injustices. We fail to act. We live comfortably in our own environmental privilege, not being affected by the directly by living near industry and pollution, and so forth. So we recognize that we are part of this problem, but we ask that you stir in us not just an awareness of environmental injustices, not just a heart for those people's harmed by environmental injustices, but also a commitment to act for environmental justice, to actually do justice. We pray all this in the name of Jesus Christ, who is the incarnate love and grace and voice of justice for the marginalized in our world. Amen. So, and by the way, I'm coming to you from my screen porch in Louisville, Kentucky, where indeed my environment is very nice. It's very green, lots of trees, and so forth. No industry or pollution nearby. So let's talk about what environmental justice is. It is about the fair treatment of all peoples, regardless of race, ethnicity, or income, in environmental laws, policies, and conditions. And as you see from the pictures here, that people of color, low-income people, young people often live near or immediately adjacent to, or play near or immediately adjacent to, learn, go to school near or immediately adjacent to sources of environmental harm, polluting facilities, industry, toxic chemicals, and so on and so forth. There are many dimensions of environmental justice issues. They include unequal exposure of low-income people and people of color to air and water pollution and to toxic chemicals. They include the poor and unequal enforcement of environmental laws. They include the fact that industrial facilities, toxic and solid waste sites, and contaminated lands, which are also called brownfields, are often located in or near low-income communities of color. There are both formal and practical barriers to the participation and influence of low-income people of color in environmental decision-making and governance. There are inequitably less and worse environmental benefits for low-income communities of color, such as parks, trees, and restored streams. There are related inequities in fields such as land use, energy, water, natural resources, food, climate, and health. Climate injustice, disaster injustice, and unequal vulnerabilities and adaptive capacities are also a part of what we think of environmental justice. And that last part about how low-income communities of color have more vulnerability and less adaptive capacity, that is what resilience justice and resilience injustice is all about, the project that I direct and have been working on in recent years. Environmental justice calls for and involves community organizing, community activism, and grassroots advocacy. And it also is about, or another dimension of environmental justice is the systemic causes and outcomes of environmental injustice and the need for systemic change. This photograph just is an opportunity to share a couple things about me. I, as a child, lived in what might be called a frontline or fence line community, actually a couple different neighborhoods in a couple different states where we lived in sort of more modest income, mixed race, mixed ethnicity neighborhood where there were various environmental harms that environmental burdens that affected our neighborhoods. And eventually, but right shortly before I started junior high school, my parents were able to move. And there is with that, I think, an illustration of what the Reverend Dr. Barbie talked about white privilege, because, my parents were able to get a home loan and were able to experience non-discriminatory market opportunities to buy a house in a better neighborhood, at least healthier, environmentally better neighborhood, which is where I went to junior high and high school and so on and so forth. But when I got to law school, I became very interested in issues of environmental justice and have been involved throughout my career as a lawyer, as a local government official, as a community activist and advocate, as part of environmental justice groups, a partner and an ally, and as a scholar and a teacher. So I have produced a variety of research that has had national and international impact in the field of environmental justice, and I teach quite a bit about environmental justice and engage and include students at the University of Louisville in the Resilience Justice Project. By the way, the picture on the bottom right is at the National Environmental Justice Conference in Washington, D.C., with U.S. EPA officials and environmental justice activists from grassroots groups and so forth in a panel that we were on together. So what does it look like? What does environmental justice look like? I'm just going to show some images that get you kind of aware, get a feel for example, in Los Angeles, how so many of the hazardous facilities are located in neighborhoods that are 80% or more residents of color. Okay. DC trash transfer stations. There are 5 trash transfer stations in Washington, DC, and every single one of them is in a census tract that is 86.9% or more Black population, and not a one anywhere close to the white, wealthy northwest portion of Washington, D.C. This is a map showing how in San Diego, California, diesel vehicle air pollution is distributed primarily in the parts of San Diego that are low income and residents of color. Cumulative environmental exposures in Chicago, reminding us that low-income neighborhoods of color, showing us how low-income neighborhoods of color are affected by multiple environmental burdens that have cumulative effects on their health and on their community. Environmental justice movement is a big part of understanding what environmental justice is about. So in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was emergence of grassroots activism by low-income people of color, and really at all levels of decision making, and around some prominent conflicts having to do with PCBs and hazardous waste facilities in Warren County, North Carolina, Shintech PVC manufacturing plant in Convent, Louisiana, which is in Cancer Alley. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. Hazardous waste incinerator in Kettleman City, California, where there were a lot of low-income Latino farm workers living, and multiple waste facilities in predominantly Black and low-income Chester, Pennsylvania. In 1991, grassroots activists came together for the National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit and wrote 17 principles of environmental justice that are still important today. Photograph of the Warren County protest in 1982. I will say one thing that's important about this is the United Church of Christ was important in participating as activists in these protests, as well as writing a really significant, important first report on environmental injustices and really noting patterns of racial inequality and environmental pollution and environmental burdens that really helped to launch the movement nationally. So United Church of Christ. Eventually, the Presbyterian Church became more involved in environmental justice issues, but was maybe not as much on the forefront or frontier of it as some other faith groups. Protest over the Kettleman Hills hazardous waste facility. Protest as part of this with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe against the Dakota Access Pipeline, reminding us that environmental justice issues are not only urban issues in low-income Black and Latino neighborhoods in cities, but also affect Native American and other indigenous groups all throughout the U.S. I'm going to show you some just some pictures, some maps that and photographs that depict environmental injustices in Louisville, just to give you a feel for patterns. So in Louisville, there are two industrial areas. One is Rubbertown, and the other is called Riverport. And Riverport's not featured on here, but it's just sort of on the left side, downriver from Rubbertown. And they're on the west end of Louisville, west and southwest end of Louisville. So what we're looking for in these pictures is to look at the patterns of how the environmental conditions relate to socioeconomic conditions and just see that these sort of patterns over and over again in South and West Louisville. So to the left part and the lower left part of the maps. Okay, so Black or African American population concentrated in the West and Southwest. Poverty households living in poverty, West and Southwest. Housing insecurity or distribution of eviction rates in the West and Southwest. The cancer rates, significantly higher than in the eastern part, significantly higher in the west and southwestern part of Louisville in comparison to the eastern part of Louisville. So that's cancer rates. This is distribution of asthma risk. Again, substantially higher in the west and southwest. Pounds of toxic chemical releases, way higher in the west and southwestern part of Louisville. Urban heat island effects, significant in the west and southwest part of Louisville, not in the east. The tree canopy cover, a lot less in the west and southwest, a lot more in the eastern part of the county. This is just a map showing, or no, just a photograph showing a West Louisville neighborhood with no street trees. Distribution of heat-related deaths. This graph, this table shows you, this is a table that I and my Resilience Justice Fellows put together, a research project that we did looking at the most marginalized neighborhoods, the neighborhoods with the highest poverty rate, lowest income, lowest or highest unemployment levels, lowest participation in elections, and highest percentage of people of color. And then we looked at the tree density in comparison to the city's average, the public park acreage per thousand residents in comparison to the city average, and the amount of impervious surface, which is pavement. And so, more impervious surface means less green space in the neighborhood. And the conditions of green and blue infrastructure are all worse in every neighborhood across all three different measures, except two of the neighborhoods have more than the average amount of parks, mostly because they, at the very edges of those neighborhoods, they have really large parks, but many of the residents of that neighborhood don't live near the large park because they're at the, kind of at the far edge of those neighborhoods. But anyway, so you see the pattern of less and worse green and blue infrastructure. Southwest Louisville is the location of the notoriously toxic Lee's Lane landfill, a Superfund site. West Louisville has generated a tremendous amount of community organizing and activism around environmental justice, including Ebony Cochran of Rubbertown Emergency Action Coalition, or REACT. That's the Ebony's in the two pictures on the left. Picture on the top right is Arnita Gadsden, Executive Director of the West Jefferson County Community Task Force, presenting at a PCUSA meeting about environmental justice issues. Resilience Justice Project has worked with youth in Southwest Louisville to engage them in environmental justice issues. Mill Creek Watershed is so this is Southwest Louisville, where we've been doing our most recent resilience justice work, polluted and water pollution, and also the LG&E facility. So both of the major LG&E, LG&E is Louisville Gas and Electric. So both of the major power plants in Louisville are in Southwest Louisville. One at the intersection of West Louisville and Southwest Louisville in the Rubbertown area, and the other at the end of the Riverport area in the far southwest portion. People live close to or next to major chemical industrial facilities like this one, where there are significant releases of toxins into the air, significant spillages and leakages, and accidents and emergencies that go beyond their regulatory permit approvals, and that affect the neighborhood and so forth. And there, if you live, this is Southwest Louisville in the Mill Creek Watershed area, living right up against a major chemical facility. And this is a different kind of industrial facility, manufacturing facility, just right across the street from Modest Housing in Southwest Louisville. And so that we have roads that produce a lot of vehicle pollution and runoff, Modest Housing, polluted streams, and again, energy facilities and industrial facilities. Lots of heavy truck traffic going through the neighborhoods. And I don't have a good way of showing you this, but like this was just, my Resilience Justice Fellows and I were out, that truck approaching the stop sign was just, I just turned around and snapped the picture. I could have snapped, 100 pictures of trucks just standing there at the corner. The LG&E Mill Creek Power Plant, warning signs about that the water is unsafe. And then this is the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, showing that in Southwest Louisville in the Mill Creek watershed that many of the neighborhoods have high social vulnerability, which means they're especially vulnerable to environmental hazards, disasters, and health crises. Some readings to suggest to you. I'm going to provide these to you as a handout, but here are 6 of my favorite and I think very influential readings on environmental justice. Some of the sort of significant founding or early work on environmental justice was by Dr. Robert Bullard, very influential. But I think some of those books are a little bit dated. So I've tried to include some more recent up-to-date works by others. And then these are some resources that I and my team at the Resilience Justice Project have published that are also have had national and international influence, and I've shared that with you as well. But what we want to really talk about today is environmental justice in the life of Christian faith. A core understanding of what our faith requires comes from Micah 6:8. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? What does it mean to do justice? What does it mean to do justice in an environmental context? In other words, what does it mean to do environmental justice? And so to explore this, I'm going to share a parable of 3 congregations. So I'm sort of building off of the parable of the Good Samaritan as a sort of structure, but I'm going to share about 3 different congregations, each of which met for study and prayer to ask, Lord Jesus, what does it mean to do justice, love our neighbors, and care for your creation? So congregation number 1 heard about major threats to environmental conditions of Majestic Mountain from mining, oil and gas production, and land development. Majestic Mountain is a beautiful and ecologically important place that many members of the congregation visit to hike, fish, camp, and stay in a new vacation resort. The members of congregation number 1 wrote letters to federal, state, and local officials to support the designation of Majestic Mountain as a national park so that it would be protected from resource extraction for the public to enjoy. Congregation number 1 also learned about the general health and environmental impacts of air pollution from industries, power plants, and vehicles, which the members of congregation number 1 worried would harm their children and grandchildren. These members of congregation number 1 wrote, joined advocacy, joined an organization advocating for stronger air quality regulations and wrote letters in support of air quality regulations. Congregation number 1 learned that a series of disasters in a faraway state, a major flood, followed by a major heat wave, both of which killed and displaced hundreds of people, was likely caused by climate change. Congregation number 1 decided to retrofit its church building with lots of energy-saving technology that would decrease congregation number 1's contribution to greenhouse gases, and also to add a rain garden on the church property that would reduce the risk of flooding to the church buildings. Now, congregation number 2 also heard about the threats to the Majestic Mountain, but congregation number 2 also learned that Majestic Mountain is considered a sacred place to a Native American tribe. Therefore, congregation number 2 invited tribal leaders to speak at congregation number 2's church about the tribe's struggle to protect Majestic Mountain for spiritual, cultural, and ecological reasons. Congregation number 2 also learned about the general health and environmental impacts of air pollution from industries, power plants, and vehicles, but they also learned that this air pollution disproportionately harms residents of low-income Black and Latino communities, especially children. Congregation number 2's Sunday school class on anti-racism added a unit on Sunday school class on anti-racism added a unit on environmental racism and injustice so that everyone could learn more about the systemic racism behind the pollution and health inequalities. They also learned about this major disaster, the flood and the heat wave and so forth caused by climate change. So they gathered donations of bottled waters, fans, and used clothes, which they sent with a mission team of youth and adults from congregation number 2. The mission team traveled to this faraway state to deliver the aid and help the disaster victims for a few days. And while they were there, they learned that most of the disaster victims were low-income immigrants from the Caribbean, Africa, and South Central Asia. And so they added a unit on climate justice to their anti-racism class. Congregation number 3 arranged with the tribal leaders to travel to Majestic Mountain and meet with them about their concerns and needs regarding the conservation of Majestic Mountain. Then congregation number 3 joined a coalition of policy advocates seeking government protection of Majestic Mountain that prioritizes the land's spiritual, cultural, and ecological values as a sacred place for the Native American tribe, with public use being secondary, limited, and respectful of the tribal uses of the land. Congregation number 3 also organized a set of Sunday school class sessions on environmental racism and injustice, but they used their education to become partners with several grassroots community-based environmental justice groups to seek stronger government regulations that take into account the cumulative impacts of pollution on low-income neighborhoods of color. And to seek changes to local land use planning and regulation in order to keep polluting facilities out of the neighborhoods. When congregation number 3 learned that about the series of disasters, the flood and the heat wave that we talked about before, they reached out to the community groups in the affected area. They learned that while the community residents wanted projects that would restore local streams and wetlands and plant more trees and native vegetation in order to mitigate both flood and heat risk, the community residents were concerned that these projects would stimulate gentrification of their neighborhoods and displacement due to rising housing costs. So congregation number 3 decided to partner with community residents, local churches in this faraway place, and local environmental justice and housing advocates in this faraway place to create a community-based green and affordable housing trust in that location. And they also, this trust then in turn created internships for youth who would then come and work in the marginalized immigrant neighborhoods. 5 years later, one of the interns working in this green and affordable housing trust in this far-off city received an offer to spend 2 years as a climate justice fellow in Haiti, working on long-term climate justice strategies. Congregation number 3, which had been funding the internship in the neighborhood in this far-off city in the US, was asked to fund half of this young person's climate justice fellowship. The congregation had a spirited and difficult discussion about whether they should be spending their mission funds maybe on their own young people or in their own local community. But they decided that the global nature of environmental and climate injustices make youth in far-off places and Haitians affected by climate change their neighbors. So their neighbors are not only the folks down the street, not only their own youth in their church, but young people working on climate justice in far-off cities, people in Haiti who are especially vulnerable to climate change. So congregation number 3 now supports environmental justice efforts in its own local communities, the Green and Affordable Housing Trust in the faraway state, and a climate justice fellow in Haiti. They've also retrofitted their own church buildings with a lot of energy-saving technology so that they can reduce their own contributions to greenhouse gases. So which of the 3 congregations did justice, loved its neighbors, and cared for God's creation? These images sort of reflect the 3 approaches of the congregation. So the first one about the meeting of the session is sort of an image that reflects the congregation number 1 is very concerned about the environment, but mostly about environmental issues that impact their members, their own people, their children and grandchildren, but maybe less plugged into a concern for or awareness of or a heart for more marginalized peoples, low-income peoples, people of color, indigenous peoples, that sort of thing. The picture on the right, top right, is Dorcetta Taylor, author of a couple of the books I mentioned, and Toxic Communities is one of them. She is a prominent environmental justice scholar at the University of Michigan, and she might be the kind of person that Congregation Number 2 would have reached out to participate, maybe even remotely, in their anti-racism class on environmental justice. But one of the things that we sort of see with Congregation Number 2 is that a lot of what they focus on is learning about environmental justice, learning about the concerns of low-income people of color, and about the issues, but maybe not as much in the way of action, or if the action is a little bit more, self-directed by the church, just the church is sort of maybe more making the decisions about what they're going to do, short-term kind of charitable aid, and less about becoming a partner in sort of transformative empowerment with the more marginalized and environmentally burdened communities. The bottom picture is environmental justice protest outside of the White House, and it really emphasizes the activism, the actions, and the partnership, the collaboration, the being an ally of marginalized communities that Congregation Number 3 is all about. Listening to people who are affected by environmental injustices, listening to their own concerns in their own words, and so forth. Okay, so what are some of the lessons that we learn from the parable? The first is that environmental justice requires other-focused humility instead of self-focused control, or attempt to control things with a focus on self. No, it requires being sort of humble and listening and looking to the well-being of others. Putting others' interest first, especially the interest of marginalized people, of oppressed people, of low-income people of color. It requires becoming educated about environmental injustices, including their causes and effects, but also acting to seek transformative justice. Learning without action and change is self-serving. So, learning by itself, adult education classes, awesome, really important, but they are a step to living out the faith, not just learning about the faith. Bottom-up empowerment, not top-down charity. Environmental justice requires sort of a trans-everything perspective. What do I mean by that? It means working across the divides, the silos in our world, the ways in which we think about issues separately, the ways in which we act on issues separately. These are all interconnected. So local issues of environmental justice issues in faraway places, and global environmental justice and climate justice are all interconnected. And to say, well, we just do one of those things is to miss what environmental justice is about, and is to be very limited in effect. Also, people and communities who are struggling against unequal exposure to pollution are also struggling for climate justice, affordable housing, health equity, more parks and trees, and so many other related conditions. And so to be engaged in environmental justice means to connect to this broader range of issues that affect the vulnerabilities and capacities of low-income communities of color. And that's where resilience justice sort of comes in. Environmental justice is a long and continuing journey, a ongoing struggle. So it is necessary to remain steadfast. Steadfast is a good biblical word, and we sometimes don't talk about it as much because we want quick results. We want to kind of move from project to project. This year, the favored project is X, and then within a year or two, we've moved on to something else, or there's a new pastor or a new session or a new issue in the news or whatever. And what I would say from all my years of working on environmental justice issues is a really big need is to stay with it. Even when it's mundane and boring and there seems to be barriers to progress, that progress is only made if we remain committed and we remain engaged and we remain steadfast. And congregations must play key roles in the struggle for environmental justice. That's absolutely essential. So what are some ways that that First Presbyterian Church could or should do environmental justice? And so I have sort of 5 general suggestions, and then I'm going to share some specific issues that First Presbyterian Church could explore getting involved in. So the first is to partner with grassroots groups in low-income neighborhoods of color to join them in their anti-racism and anti-oppression struggle against unhealthy and inequitable environmental conditions, and to their struggle for healthy and equitable environmental conditions. Okay, so this partnership should happen locally, but it also, think about a partnership that could be with a community that's in the US, but in a faraway location. Okay, sort of thinking a little bit more like the early church in Acts, where yes, they took care of folks in their own community, but they also took care of people in need in other cities, in other faraway places, and their view of God's calling and that sense of who your neighbor is was not just the person next door down the street, but people in other localities around the US and in faraway places outside the US, in other nations and elsewhere in the world. Secondly, First Pres could partner with indigenous groups against continuing colonial violence against their lands, waters, and people. And you see the picture here, you recognize it, of Andrew and Brooke and tribal leaders, Pueblo leaders at the Caja del Rio. And so the Caja del Rio is a perfect example of a colonial violence against the lands and waters and peoples, indigenous peoples, in just in your own backyard, right? And the threats from things like oil and gas development and mining, graffiti and vandalism and violence, and so on and so forth. Gun violence and degradation of a sacred cultural and spiritual and ecological place. So again, you've got issues locally, but there are issues elsewhere in the US, not right in your backyard, where indigenous groups are seeking partners, and also indigenous communities elsewhere in the world that are really under threat from so many environmental harms and from climate change. Third, First Presbyterian Church members could support regulations, laws, and policies that address environmental injustices, not just the regulations, laws, and policies that benefit us specifically, that are about the environmental issues that we particularly love or get benefit from, but the environmental issues that affect low-income people of color, the most marginalized and most vulnerable, most oppressed peoples. And again, regulations, laws, and policies can be local, they can be elsewhere in the country, or they can be outside the US. Fourth, First Presbyterian Church can contribute to climate justice, not only by reducing our contribution to climate change, but also, and so that's underway, right? We're trying to look at the church facilities and church operations to see how we can reduce our contribution to climate change. But also, we should be thinking about collaborating with marginalized and vulnerable communities to build their resilience and adaptive capacities. As Jen Black has already shared in a couple of different class sessions in the Acts 2 adult ed classes, climate change is already underway, and we desperately need to put the brakes on it. But it's like a skid, right? We're gonna continue to experience the effects of climate change, and they are hitting low-income people of color, both in the U.S. and around the world, vastly more significantly, vastly more harmfully than white white communities, wealthier communities, American communities. And so again, we need to be thinking about how we can be partnering with marginalized and vulnerable communities to help build their resilience to climate change. And then finally, I would suggest that financially supporting young people who are working for environmental, climate, and resilience justice is something that the church could do. And that because young people deeply care about this, maybe not every young person, but overall, the the children, youth, young adults of today see these issues as directly affecting them, affecting their future, and as ethical imperatives of caring for and seeking justice with and for the most marginalized and oppressed peoples, the people who are being significantly burdened by climate change, significantly burdened by environmental harms, by continued behaviors that are consumeristic and destructive and self-serving in the short run, but really affecting the future of the earth, of humanity, of our world. And so, young people want to be involved, but where are jobs? Where are the funded internships? They're with. Quite frankly, they're with the businesses and the government agencies and the law firms and so on and so forth that are going to, they're part of the problem. And so, activism and making a meaningful, transformative change is often unfunded work that young people want to be involved in. And so the question is, could the church help, really sort of see these young people as missionaries, as people who are, developing, a long-term commitment to this work and to maybe support them. Okay, so that's 15 different projects. Surely we can't, how can we do all that, right? Surely we can't do all that. Well, I'm going to say that sort of sounds a lot like the disciples in Andrew's sermon last week on Jesus feeding the 5,000 with only 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? So the disciples were timid and saying, we can only feed a few. Sort of sounds a lot like sessions, committees, even pastors who say, wow, well, we need to pick and choose. We can only do so much, etc. And Jesus says, in contrast, we will feed everyone. The Bible's clear. God regularly calls and empowers God's people to do the seemingly impossible, to get out of our comfort zone, to take a leap of faith, to take on these imperatives that seem overwhelming. So Moses, Battle of Jericho, just all of these sort of things. Early church, Jesus' birth, resurrection from the dead, miracles, etc. So, David and Goliath, goes on and on. And so that, and I think what we see time and again is that when a group of people of faith take on big challenges that they feel called to take on, but that are scary and seemingly impossible and so forth, it is invigorating, it is revitalizing, it is life infusing, because it is about making a stretch, making a sacrifice out of love, out of loving our neighbor, out of loving God's creation, out of loving people who are burdened and harmed by racism and inequality and environmental injustices. So where to begin? Well, let me first suggest that Santa Fe Southside community has been struggling against environmental injustices, such as in the last couple of years, an asphalt permit, as just an example. And, it's a question, I mean, is how is First Presbyterian Church, how have y'all as residents of Santa Fe, as members of the church community, engaged with this issue, worked alongside the community members in the South Side, joined their struggle for environmental justice. Those issues are ongoing. So South Side, get a little bit further away, South Valley of Albuquerque, big environmental justice issues. Indigenous communities, Native American tribes in New Mexico and the Southwest, the Pueblo, the Navajo, etc., really struggling for environmental justice. Great opportunities to be an ally, a partner, a collaborator, somebody who says, I'm going to show that I love you by joining you in your struggle for justice. Also, another big opportunity in the South Side is helping to connect South Side youth to nature, parks, outdoor recreation, and learning. So New Mexico has an amazing outdoor equity fund. That's important, but the fund needs to be implemented. There need to be volunteers. It needs to not just be some grants and some opportunities, but actually realities of youth being connected to nature, parks, outdoors, especially youth who historically, typically don't have access. And also funding to expand the potential impact of this fund. If the only thing that is going to happen is a government fund is going to provide outdoor opportunities and equities for youth of color, then that's going to be pretty limited. The New Mexico Outdoor Equity Fund should be, shouldn't be the maximum. It should be the minimum. It should be the starting point, not the ending point. So great opportunities there, something that this church could do. You're already involved in the Caja del Rio, and I'm sure Andrew's pulled some of you into advocating for protection of Oak Flat in Arizona, which are both are both really important to tribes and in our cultural, spiritual, and ecological landscapes that are threatened. But the thing here I'd suggest is not only cleanups and education, but also activism. So, it's great to go out to the Caja and do a cleanup. It's great to go out and have a service and learn more about it. But then, where is the action to protect that? Where's the action to try to influence those who have power in society to protect these landscapes? Be a supporter, an ally, or partner in the struggle of St. James Parish, Louisiana, to remedy nearly 2 centuries of environmental racism. So this is a so this has been going on for a while. So this is where I mentioned Convent, Louisiana. I mentioned the Cancer Alley. So Cancer Alley is an area from Baton Rouge to New Orleans with lots of chemical and petroleum and other heavy industrial and polluting facilities. Very low income. So the median income, I think, is less than $10,000 a household. Predominantly Black, many people who are descendants of people who were enslaved in the area, but they have been burdened by land use policies and planning and zoning and environmental permitting decisions that have placed all of these industrial harms in their communities, that have degraded and disrespected Black cemeteries, that have created obstacles to safe and healthy housing, and so on and so forth. And so they have brought a major lawsuit challenging, alleging violations of their constitutional rights. It's a big uphill battle, this lawsuit, but it is an important attention-getting, framing kind of action that is saying, where the community is saying, we are no longer going to put up with this environmental racism. We're no longer going to put up with these unhealthy, grossly unhealthy conditions that have produced cancer at outrageously extreme levels that couldn't possibly be based solely on lifestyle. It has to be all of the exposure to pollution in the area and so forth. And so actually, many of the people who are behind the lawsuit and the activism are Black women of faith. Okay, so it reminds me a little bit of some of the stories that we've been hearing in the last couple of years in Acts 2 and in Harry's sermons. And so, wouldn't it be amazing if First Presbyterian Church were to reach out and say, we want to support what you're doing. We're here in Santa Fe. We're not. We haven't experienced Cancer Alley, but we believe in what you're doing, and we want to be an ally or a partner in your struggle. Another potential opportunity is to fund marginalized students at the University of Louisville to work with the Resilience Justice Project to build equitable adaptation to climate change and grassroots transformations of neighborhood environments in low-income communities of color throughout the U.S. And I know this is arguably a self-serving recommendation because that's my project, and these are the students who would be working with me. But I want to mention a couple things about this. So and actually right at the moment, we've just gotten a big federal grant that's going to fund students to work on how to help low-income communities of color in 8 major coastal urban areas around the U.S. Build equitable adaptation to climate change in local policies and plans. And so it's exciting work, and we're being funded, and it's good. But the funding, that's just a 1-year funding. And what we find is that we have a lot of students who are have themselves experienced environmental injustice or come from more marginalized backgrounds. They may be students of color, they may be low-income students, they may be students who grew up in really burdened communities, LGBTQI plus students, and so on and so forth. And they want to be part of the Resilience Justice Project and making a difference, but that requires funding. And so the question is, could First Presbyterian Church fund a student to do that and partner with them in that way and be a part of supporting what they want to do. And I think another thing is to support climate adaptive indigenous agricultural practices in Africa against corporate industrial agricultural forces. This is this is a big issue in Africa. It's related to climate justice and climate adaptation. This is actually something that the Resilience Justice Project is going to be involved in the future, but it's a way to connect to people who are struggling in a faraway place in Africa and to help support them and what they're doing. And then finally, there are a variety of legal and regulatory actions that could be taken. So in terms of laws and regulations, this is a lot about, writing letters, signing petitions, sending messages to members of Congress, writing comments when government agencies publish proposed regulations, because they're getting comments from people who don't want environmental justice actions to be taken, people who don't want industry or extractive extractive industries or polluters or whatever to be held more to account. They don't want to there are people in Congress who do not want funding being funneled to the most environmentally burdened communities that are really struggling. These are low-income communities of color, and the Biden administration is directing funding in this direction, and there are people in Congress who do not want that. And then there's just issues like there are issues that maybe people in the government care about, but they're not getting top priority because there's not a groundswell of voices of people like us saying, hey, this is important. We care about this. This doesn't affect us directly, but we care about it because it affects our brothers and sisters in Black communities, in Latino communities, in Asian communities, in indigenous communities, in low-income communities. So one is just one of the really key things that environmental justice advocates agree is we need to see more cumulative impacts analysis in permitting decisions, especially air pollution permits, but others as well. And so right now, federal agencies have issued some guidance to encourage cumulative impacts analysis, but it's questionable whether that is going to really stand up against a legal challenge in the current state of the Supreme Court, which is very hostile to agencies making these decisions in informal kind of ways. So some agencies are considering regulations more formal, and the question is, again, they get pushback from opponents. And so, and very often folks like us don't know about this. We don't know how to make the comments, how to support the adoption of the regulations, maybe how to push the agency to go further than what it's proposed, to not give some sort of modest half-loaf kind of approach, but instead to take a bolder step and say, we want everybody, regardless of race or income, to have a full loaf. And legislation. And sometimes I think, especially given where the Supreme Court is now, some of what's going to happen is Congress is going to have to act. State legislatures are going to have to act. City councils and county commissions are going to have to act and adopt legislation. And that requires a groundswell of support from voters. Regulation of PFAS. PFAS are forever chemicals. And the thing is, we've known for a long time that they very much harm humans in low-income communities of color. They stay in your body and cause all sorts of harms to your body forever. And but the thing is, finally, we're seeing action by the EPA on this because we've now discovered that all sorts of people, white people, elite people, wealthy people, people who have privilege are also affected by PFAS, and now that generates attention. But it is modest, and the EPA is only regulating a few of the PFAS chemicals, and has put a pause on their adoption of regulations. Well, that's concerning. There needs to be tremendous pressure, support. Justice 40 is a great initiative of the Biden administration to direct 40% of funds to low-income communities of color. But is it being implemented, and how well is it being implemented, and is there going to be pushback in Congress? Speaking of Congress, Senator Manchin from West Virginia and others in Congress are trying to exempt various energy projects. Some of them are supposedly clean energy projects, others are pipelines and so forth, but to exempt them from permitting requirements and environmental impact reviews in order to facilitate them. And interestingly enough, there are environmental law professors who love protecting the environment who are saying, hey, we need to just really move clean energy transitions faster. And so we just need to dispense with these legal and regulatory requirements. But the problem is, when we dispense with the legal and regulatory requirements, it's mostly low-income communities of color that experience those impacts that that end up not ever being considered, or that the locations of these projects are put in low-income communities of color, or that they are burdened on indigenous lands, or so on and so forth. And so, again, there maybe needs to be some pushback, some questioning, what kinds of exemptions are really needed. How is this going to play out, and so forth. And then finally, Congress has been considering for some years this Environmental Justice for All Act, but it doesn't really go anywhere, again, because it's not viewed as a high priority with mainstream voters, because of the political marginalization of low-income people of color. That's something we can do. We can say, hey, we can write to members of Congress, say, hey, this is important. This needs to be passed, and so forth. Just going to share then finally, and then again, I'm going to provide this to y'all in a document, some different websites about various denominations and faith groups and so forth that are involved in environmental justice issues, so that you can see the variety of different efforts that are underway where people of faith are living out what it means to do justice by engaging with issues of environmental racism and environmental injustice. And so I won't go through all these. You can take a look at the links and so forth when you get a chance. Finally now comes to a conclusion of the presentation and an opportunity for us to discuss in the class some of these issues. Thanks so much.
Well, Tony, I just want to say thank you. You did an amazing job, a ton of information. I'll be making sure that we share that on Earth Keepers and up on our website and on our Take Action. I think it's a really good overview, but also really practical. I love the fact that you had all these kind of biblical stories that, could be applied to these lessons. I thought that was awesome. So thank you.
And this handout that we had here in paper is on the website now. You go on the front page of the website and see the do environmental justice and go under the post. It's listed there, so people online can get this handout easily. And Andrew, we just had he's gone now, but we just had a task for you on the south side to lead some. Did you hear that discussion?
I heard a little bit about the youth and teen center, but
yeah, and we decided you could lead them on a hike.
Sure. Yeah, no, Carmichael and I are working on that already. And him and I don't know if many folks in the congregation know this. Started working on the creation of that teen center about a decade ago, and it's kind of finally coming into fruition. As Tony said, it was a long process, and him and I fought for 3 or 4 years just to try to get the funding from the city. And the land had been dedicated for about 15 years, and it just was a vacant lot. So Carmichael Dominguez and I worked really hard on trying to get that teen center up and going for about 3 or 4 years, and kind of finally got it going. And then it's, final approval and all the money and the design finally came through. But yeah, it's something that's desperately needed on that side of town. But I'm happy to lead a hike for the teen center, and also the Boys and Girls Club is also over there.
I have a general comment. We recently received a check from the state of New Jersey. Most of us did. And I think it would be really good to be thinking about, if we don't need that desperately, that we find a way to put it into action for things like environmental justice or other things related to the underserved people.
It's a great idea, Esther. Yeah, so New Mexico, Tony, just for your heads up, gave kind of a credit to families. I think, kind of the amounts vary depending on income and whatnot, but they're a couple hundred to a couple $1,000s per family.
Tony, I'm curious, this word resilience is all over, and thinking about these communities that have been marginalized for so long in so many different ways. Talking to people are tired of having to be resilient. And how are we able to encourage the energy to be in this fight, especially with young people who have learned this since day one and know these things, going through school, people know this stuff. Yet it feels so hopeless sometimes when our faith communities are pushing out young people and our government's pushing out any policy that's doing good work. And so it's how do we bring energy, and how do we keep that word resilience feeling less like, oh my gosh, it's another step we have to do after we've been fighting for so much.
Yeah, that's a good question, and there aren't easy answers there. I think one challenge is how the word resilience gets used by different different interests in society, and so sometimes I think that's a frustration is people see resilience being kind of used to say, hey, we've got to prop up the coal economy, or we've got to prop up land development in businesses and wealthy development in on the coast in Florida and Miami and so forth. And so there's sort of contested meanings of resilience, but I think a lot of people feel like, okay, sometimes resilience just feels like we just gotta pull ourselves up by our bootstraps to kind of figure this out on our own. But interestingly, we also there are days like that. Everybody has days like that. But we also hear a lot from people in the global South and in low-income communities of color who are saying, hey, these conditions are everyday experiences for us, and we don't want people to give up on the idea that our community can be resilient and can thrive. So I think with resilience, and I didn't do a whole presentation on resilience justice, but part of part of how we kind of approach this is the capacity to thrive as a community, and so I think that that's viewed as a goal, but I also think that there's a lot of fatigue over the constant struggle, which you're getting at. I also guess one thing I feel like is that there is a real thirst for collaboration, for partnership, for realizing none of us are in this all alone. And I think that helps to re-energize folks to feel like, hey, there's this other community that's having the same struggle we are. It's not just us, it's, and they've learned some things, we've learned some things, we can share that. And then also, I think really just the resources, the support that can happen. And so, when the University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law started creating these resilience justice fellowships and using resources that were available to support students doing this, there was this sense of, hey, this, somebody cares about this, somebody's paying attention to this, somebody's investing resources, and the amounts are never enough, and the day-to-day work can be tiring and discouraging, especially because it's long-term work, and we don't see big changes in the short run. But there's also sort of what's our alternative? I mean, the alternative is to just say, well, wow, this is just too big, and to give up, and then all of those folks who don't want action on climate change, who don't want to see justice, have won. And so that it's unfair, it's deeply unfair, but I also kind of feel like the Bible is full of stories of people who were unfairly marginalized and oppressed, and just had to draw on their faith to keep persisting in the struggle for justice and for a world in which love and peace and compassion are predominant, because very often that's there's so much pushback against that in the world. And so so I not any good clear answers, but sometimes at least with my students, sometimes it's just about sitting down. We're going to pause the work for for a couple hours and sit down over some food, or go for a hike and talk about how we're feeling discouraged, and sort of address those issues. And again, I think if you bear that alone, it's a lot harder than if you share it with others.
Are you noticing the youth you work with coming from backgrounds of faith?
Yeah, so I mean, so it's a mix. I mean, so there are definitely young people who are coming from backgrounds of faith, and there are young people who are not, or who I think they're young people who think a lot about spiritual and moral imperatives and dimensions of life, but who are pretty skeptical of organized religion. I mean, I think that's not at all surprising, and we see that a lot in society. And I think what's interesting is that I find young people who are surprised and encouraged that there are places like First Presbyterian Church that are out there. They see a lot of religious organizations as being kind of very self-serving, very conservative, white nationalist kind of places. And so there are times when I'm sharing, like, for example, we're doing this class and they're like, oh wow, really? And they want to know more. There's not a hostility, there's actually an openness. So those are great discussions to have. But again, I think a lot of things about faith, those conversations have been had way too simplistically in the past. And so they're difficult, they're complex, they're nuanced issues. And I think young people want to have those conversations, but where's the space in which to have that, where it's not a sort of religious indoctrination program, where there's not sort of where the organization doesn't have sort of a self-interest in advancing a particular agenda and that kind of stuff. And so I actually
think we have the space, and we keep the lights on during the weekdays. I think we have the space. Churches have so many campuses and so many resources, and you're in Louisville and you're seeing thousands of dollars go from Diane Moffett into halfway Matthew 25. And so it's just we have opportunities, and it's I think we're in a place where we could do a lot of really great work.
Yeah, I that absolutely. I just think I end up with conversations with the young people who are working on resilience justice, where they're really just not going to go to a church building. That's not really, there's just a lot of obstacles to that, but there's a lot of openness to connecting with people of faith and learning more about how faith issues shape the movement for environmental justice and so forth. So I mean, I think it's there. It's just, I think sometimes the more traditional structures, the building, that kind of stuff are obstacles. But good point. I mean, thank you. Yeah, there's so much that can be done.
Tony, can I ask one question? So with just the work that's going on, and I don't understand if an organization proceeds with an initiative, and somebody, and normally that would be a large corporation or someone that doesn't profit from guidelines set in place to try to protect environmental justice, then does that organization, then can they just file a lawsuit that would continually just kind of grow, gets to a Supreme Court that I think at this point, we all know would just strike it down. I mean, how do you guard against that? Or is there any way to guard against something like that?
So it's a great question. And so first of all, I think the first point is not to not to just admit defeat from the outset, but instead to do it, to force them to have to file the lawsuits, to force the issues out there, even if even if there's some question about whether it'll survive a legal challenge or not. I think sometimes it's just about saying this is the right thing to do and we're going to do it, and sort of see how it plays out. Also, I mean, I think another thing is that it's quite possible that by the time some of this stuff winds its way to the Supreme Court personnel could change again. I mean, if depending on the outcome of elections, depending on, retirements or deaths of Supreme Court justices and so on and so forth. So, the Supreme Court's not stuck in, they're in a hostile place right now in terms of the majority, but it's not always going to be the case. And then I think the thing is that agencies need to be savvy about how they go about what they're doing. But then I think this finally brings me to the last point is, which I think that environmental justice advocates have been kind of working on this for a while, but I think a lot more environmental experts need to be pushing legislative agendas more. I think one of the things that's coming out from the Supreme Court is that the majority of justices don't think that agencies have the power to fix things that Congress hasn't adequately addressed, that it's up to Congress to address it. Well, is that realistic? Well, probably not, because, it's very divided, and, you have to have 60 votes in the Senate for things to move forward. And Congress is sort of like notoriously bad for writing legislation that's vague and that doesn't, this kind of gives the appearance of addressing a problem without providing all the tools. And so we've tended to rely on these administrative agencies to do the work. And I think, the majority of the Supreme Court is saying, well, that's beyond the power of the agencies. So I feel like, my colleagues who are environmental law professors kind of gave up on legislation a long time ago. And their view was, the agencies have to fix this for us. Well, the Supreme Court's just not letting that be. So I think we have to sort of think, return to and think again about how we can, do a legislative agenda. And I would say that, some of the legislation that's happened in the last couple of years has not been perfect, but I actually think that advocates for environmental justice, the president and the administration and some of the leaders in Congress have been very savvy about getting, really squeezing a lot out of things like infrastructure financing and, budget bills and that kind of thing that, where we're actually getting more progress. And the other thing that's interesting that's out there is, sometimes the agencies are the slow ones to act. So PFAS is an example where actually there's been some bipartisan support in Congress to force the EPA to finally address PFAS. And there's just been this reluctance, regardless of who's in power. And so I think that's has a lot to do with the complexities and they just sort of the feeling like, okay, this is such a big problem, we don't really want to tackle it. And so again, if there's support and pressure from people, then you get, I mean, it may push, it may push the political momentum over the line to where you actually get some action. But yeah, lots of affected industries and business sector groups can file lawsuits against these regulations, and the current state of the court is at least at the Supreme Court level, is relatively hostile to them. We're also seeing some good legislation come out of state and local governments. So actually, just in the past year or so, New York State passed the most aggressive environmental justice statute in the country. And for a long time, California had the most extensive environmental justice statute. And now New York has gone even further than California, which is, is exciting and interesting to see. And so there's things like that are happening as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Chuck.
you.
Oh, wow.
Everybody, thanks.